In the spring of 1987, at a textile mill liquidation sale in Gaston County, North Carolina, a 31-year-old woman named Dorothy Vance paid $200 for a Draper X3 loom that two mill owners had already walked past without stopping. The machine was a wreck. The reed was bent along 6 inches of its width. The heddle frames were warped from years of humidity. The timing belt had snapped, and someone had wound a length of baling twine around the drive shaft as a temporary fix that had become permanent. The shuttle boxes were cracked. The warp beam had a flat spot worn into it from sitting in one position for what the liquidator estimated was 4 years, maybe 5. Rust had worked into the pivot points of the beater assembly. The electrical panel on the side smelled like something had burned in it once, a long time ago, and nobody had looked at it since. The liquidator was a man named Carl Briggs, who'd been selling off failed mills for 11 years, and had learned to keep his opinions about buyers to himself. He had not entirely mastered this skill. "I want you to understand what you're looking at," Carl said, standing next to Dorothy as she ran her hand along the warp beam. "This machine hasn't run since 1983. Possibly 1982. The reed alone." "You see the reed," Dorothy said, "going to cost you more to replace than you paid for the whole unit. How much do you want for it?" Carl looked at her the way men look at women who aren't listening to them in the way they'd hoped. "I've had it listed at $250. Nobody's moved on it. Give me $200 and haul it yourself." "And haul it myself," Dorothy said. Carl wrote the receipt. Dorothy loaded the loom onto a borrowed flatbed with help from her younger sister Pam and Pam's husband Roy, who was a decent man but spent the entire loading process explaining why the loom wasn't worth loading. By the time they pulled out of the mill yard, Roy had suggested 3 times that they could still turn around, and Dorothy had not responded once. Gaston County noticed. Mill towns in 1987 were the kind of places where industrial equipment moving down a residential street got talked about, and a Draper loom on a flatbed, driven by a woman in a canvas jacket, got talked about more than most things. By the end of that week, Rory had made its rounds from the diner on Main to the laundromat on Cedar and back again. Dorothy Vance bought the loom from the Caldwell liquidation, the one they couldn't give away. $40, paid $200 for a machine that hadn't turned a thread in 5 years. Rory had the shape of a joke. It was missing a punchline, but people trusted that one was coming. Let me tell you about Dorothy Vance, because what she did with that loom over the next 14 months doesn't make sense unless you understand who she was and where she'd spent the previous 20 years learning it. Dorothy was born in 1946 in Belmont, North Carolina, second of 4 children, raised by a woman named Iris Vance, who ran a home alterations business out of a back room that smelled permanently of steam and sizing. Iris Vance was not a warm woman in the way people use that word to mean easy and soft. She was warm the way a forge is warm, intensely, purposefully, and in service of making things harder than they started. She pressed seams with a conviction that bordered on moral. $40. She could look at a garment from 6 feet away and tell you where the tension was wrong in the bobbin thread. She kept a notebook of every repair she'd done, every alteration, every customer complaint and its resolution, in handwriting so small and precise it looked typeset. Children, Dorothy was the only one of the 4 children who spent real time in that back room. Not because Iris asked her to, because Dorothy couldn't stay away from the machines. $14, there were 3 of them, a treadle singer that had belonged to Iris's mother, a commercial brother that Iris used for heavy work, and a Bernina that she'd bought used in 1961 and treated with a reverence usually reserved for surgical instruments. Dorothy learned them in order, youngest to most complex. You learn anything that matters. By the time she was 14, she could take the brother apart and reassemble it in the dark. Not because she ever needed to do it in the dark. Because Iris had told her once that if you truly understood a machine, light was optional. Dorothy had taken this literally, which was the correct interpretation. She married at 23, which in Belmont in 1969 was considered waiting. Her husband was a man named Gary, whose last name she took and later returned, and who is not the subject of this story, except to note that he left in 1979, and that when he left, Dorothy had 2 daughters under 10, a house with a $340 monthly payment, $2,100 in a savings account, and a commercial sewing machine she'd bought at an estate sale for $75 that she ran out of the utility room 4 evenings a week, doing alterations and custom orders for people who'd heard about her work from other people who'd heard about it first. She did not apply for assistance. She did not ask her mother for money, though Iris offered. She sat down with a notebook, her own notebook, modeled on the one she'd watched Iris keep for 20 years, and wrote down what she needed to earn, what she was currently earning, and what the distance between those 2 numbers required. Required more hours and a second machine. On. She bought the second machine from a closing alteration shop in Cramerton, a Juki Industrial that the owner priced at $400, and Dorothy talked to $280 after a 20-minute conversation about the machine's service history that left the owner feeling he'd been fairly assessed rather than lowballed. She had the Juki running in her utility room within a week, and by the end of that year she was working 6 evenings instead of 4. Her daughters were old enough to fold finished work and tag it with the small white labels that said Vance Alterations in letters Dorothy had stamped herself, and the distance between what she needed and what she earned had closed to something she could manage. She managed it for 8 years. In 1987, the utility room had become 2 rooms. Dorothy had hired a woman named Cecilia to handle basic hemming and button work 3 days a week. She had 12 regular commercial accounts. Dry cleaners, bridal shops, a uniform supply company out of Charlotte that sent her bundles of work shirts and coveralls that needed custom sizing. Business paid for itself, and paid for the house, and paid for her daughter's school clothes, and occasionally, if the quarter was good, paid for something extra. Not often, but occasionally. This was the woman who bought the broken loom. Here's what Gaston County didn't know. Dorothy Vance had not bought that loom on impulse. She had been watching the hand-woven textile market for 3 years, since 1984, $30 on, since a woman from Asheville had walked into a craft show in Charlotte, selling hand-woven table runners for $45 apiece, and sold out of 86 of them in a single afternoon. Dorothy had done the math, standing in that exhibition hall. She'd walked back to the woman's table 3 times. She'd bought one of the last runners and taken it home and spent an evening examining the structure of the weave, the way an engineer examines a bridge. Not admiring it, understanding it. The problem was equipment, a production floor loom capable of generating commercial volume, the kind you needed to make $45 table runners a viable business rather than a hobby. Cost between $200 and $2, or $100 new. Used, in good condition, between $600 and $900. Dorothy didn't have $600 to put into an unproven venture. What she had was the ability to look at a broken machine and see what it would take to make it run. $40 on. In October of 1986, she'd driven to a weaving supply house in Asheville and spent 4 hours asking questions of a man named Gerald, who had repaired looms professionally for 19 years, and was not accustomed to being asked questions by people who already knew half the answers. She came home with 17 pages of notes, in her small handwriting, a catalog of replacement parts, and a clear understanding of exactly what a Draper X3, in the condition she'd been tracking at the Caldwell mill, would cost to rebuild. He'd priced it, every component. Reed replacement, $34. Heddle frames, $28 for the set if she sourced them from a weaving co-op in Tennessee that dealt in salvage parts. New timing belt, $12. Total box rebuild, $15 in materials if she fabricated the replacement pieces herself using hardwood stock from a lumber yard in Gastonia. Electrical panel assessment and repair, unknown, but the symptoms suggested a single burned relay, and relays for that panel ran $8 at an electrical supply house. New warp beam bearings, $22. Total estimated cost, under $140, plus the $200 for the machine, plus her time. $14, and she'd worked it out before she ever drove to the liquidation sale. That's what Carl Briggs missed. He thought he was watching a woman make an impulsive decision about a machine she didn't understand. He was actually watching a woman execute the final step of a plan she'd been building for 30 months. She started the rebuild in April of 1987 after tax season, when the alterations business slowed enough to give her evenings back. Her daughters were 16 and 13. The older one, Renee, had her mother's hands and her grandmother's patience, and understood without being told that the machine in the garage was not a hobby. Dorothy stripped the loom to its frame over 2 weekends. Every component came off in order and went onto a sheet of butcher paper on the garage floor, labeled in marker, sorted by assembly group. The frame itself was solid white oak, the kind of construction they stopped bothering with sometime in the 1960s, when cost-cutting reached even the things that were meant to last. She cleaned the frame with a damp cloth, inspected the mortise joints, found them tight, and left them alone. You don't fix what isn't broken. Her mother had said this so many times that Dorothy sometimes heard it in her sleep. The reed she pulled first. 6 inches of bent wire that made the machine mechanically useless for anything requiring consistent shed geometry, which was everything. She'd ordered a replacement from a weaving supplier in Ohio, $34, standard Draper sizing, 12 dents per inch. It arrived in 9 days in a cardboard sleeve and fit the beater housing exactly. She mounted it and moved on. 40 Heddle frames were worse than the reed but more repairable. The warping was thermal, humidity over years, wood swelling and resetting in a curve. Dorothy clamped them flat between 2 lengths of angle iron she borrowed from Roy's shop, applied careful heat with a heat gun, and held them for 48 hours. 3 of the 4 frames came back true. She replaced with a salvage frame from the Tennessee co-op, $7 for the individual piece, which was better than the $28 she'd budgeted. The timing belt was a 20-minute job once she had the replacement in hand. Snap the old one off, route the new one through the drive sequence she'd diagrammed from Gerald's notes, tension it to spec. She ran the loom by hand through 50 cycles to confirm the timing. It was right on the first try, which satisfied her in the quiet way that precision always satisfied Dorothy Vance. Not pride, exactly. Confirmation. The electrical panel she opened with more care. The smell of old burning is distinctive. Sharp, carbonized, final. And she'd learned from Iris's commercial machine years ago that you never ignored it, and you never assumed it was resolved just because it had stopped happening. She found the burned relay in the second row of the panel, exactly where the symptom pattern had suggested. She photographed the panel before she touched anything, a habit she'd developed after a disassembly project in 1981, where she'd trusted her memory and shouldn't have. The relay came out cleanly. The replacement went in. She closed the panel, connected the machine to a grounded outlet through an extension cord she'd wired herself to include an inline fuse, and ran it at low speed for 20 minutes. It ran. Smoothly, not yet. The warp beam was still rough from its flat spot, and the beater assembly needed the pivot points cleaned and oiled, and the shuttle boxes needed the fabricated replacement pieces she hadn't finished yet. But it ran, the timing was right. The shed was opening cleanly, the heddles were traveling true. The machine worked. It had always worked, and the neglect and the years of sitting. $40 on. It had just been waiting for someone who understood the difference between a machine that was finished and a machine that was waiting. The shuttle box work took 3 weekends. Dorothy had never done finished woodworking at this level, which meant she approached it the way she approached everything she didn't know. She learned it first. She practiced the joinery on scrap pine until the joints were clean, then cut the shuttle box pieces from hard maple she'd bought for $14 at the lumber yard. She shaped them, fitted them, glued them, clamped them, cure for a full week before she touched them again. Beam flat spot she addressed last. You can't turn a warp beam true on a home drill press. Dorothy knew this. What you can do is build up the low side with an epoxy filler rated for metal applications, let it cure fully, and sand it to a tolerance close enough that the warp tension distributes evenly under working load. She found this technique in a loom repair manual from 1974 that a used bookshop in Charlotte had for $3. The manual was spiral-bound and written by a woman named Helen Keswick, who had clearly spent her life fixing what other people threw away. Dorothy read it twice. $40,000 the repair worked. $40. She warped the loom for the first time on a Saturday morning in June of 1988, 14 months after the liquidation sale. 41, with Renee sitting on an overturned bucket watching and occasionally handing her the threading hook. The warp was a natural cotton in 2 weights, 8-2 and 3-2, enough to run a test piece and verify the shed geometry before she committed to a production pattern. Dorothy threw the first pick and watched the shed close cleanly behind it. Wove a 12-inch sampler, 4 different weave structures, checking the tension, watching for skipped heddles, listening to the beater. The draper ran without a complaint. The flat spot on the warp beam was invisible in the finished cloth. The shed opened to a dimension that would handle any shuttle she needed to run. The machine was not what it had been when it left the factory in 1959. $100 on. It was better because every component had been evaluated individually and either confirmed or replaced, and nothing had been left in place on the assumption that it was probably fine. Neighbor to the west, a retired mill hand named Earl Stover, who'd spent 30 years working drapers at the Lorre plant in Gastonia, heard the loom running from his yard that Saturday morning and came to the fence line. Dorothy saw him and walked over. "It's a draper," Earl said. 43, Dorothy said, 1959. Earl looked toward the garage. "Those machines have been out of production for 15 years. Leon, I know. Where'd you find parts?" "Made some of them, sourced the rest." $1 on. Earl was quiet for a moment, in the way that men who've worked machinery all their lives go quiet when they encounter someone who understands it. "What are you going to run on it?" "Couple runners. Maybe placemats if the margin works out. I have a craft show circuit I've been selling alterations work at. I want to test whether hand-woven textiles move at a volume worth scaling." "Move," Earl said. He said it with the flat certainty of a man stating a weather forecast. "People want things that were made by a person. Mills can't sell that. A machine can't sell that. You can." Dorothy nodded. She had already believed this. It was useful to have it confirmed by someone who had spent 30 years on the other side of it. Total investment to that point: Draper X3 frame and components at liquidation, $200. Replacement reed $34. Salvage heddle frame $7. Timing belt $12. Electrical relay and hardware high $11. Shuttle box maple stock $14. Warp beam repair materials $9. Miscellaneous fasteners cleaning supplies the loom repair manual $18. First warp and test yarn $22. Total 327. 14 months of evenings and weekends. 2 daughters who learned to work quietly in the same room with someone who was concentrating. 1 retired mill hand over the fence who became, over the following years, a source of knowledge that no book contained. First craft show she ran the woven work alongside the alterations table was in September of 1988 in Shelby. She had 22 table runners, 8 placemats, and 4 kitchen towels. $40 she sold out of everything by early afternoon, not because the prices were low. She'd priced them at the Asheville woman's level, $45 for the runners, $22 for the placemats, but because the work was right. The selvages were even, the colors were considered. $300 on. The cloth had the particular quality that hand-woven cloth has when the person who made it understood what they were doing. You can't describe it exactly. You recognize it when you pick it up. A woman at the next table, a potter from Lincolnton named Deb, watched Dorothy sell the last runner and shook her head. How long did those take you? Then, the runners average about 2.5 hours each. Deb did the math. You're underselling your labor. Testing the market, Dorothy said. If the market holds, the price goes up next show. 400 the market held. 300's on. By the spring of 1989, Dorothy had added a second show circuit and hired Cecilia's sister to take over more of the alterations volume so Dorothy could wait her own hours toward the loom. By the end of that year, the woven work was generating more revenue than the alterations business, which had taken her 8 years to build. The loom ran 5 days a week. Renee had learned to warp it and had opinions about color that were better than Dorothy's, which Dorothy acknowledged without difficulty because she had not raised her daughters to be modest about things they were genuinely good at. Let me tell you about what happened in 1991, because this is where the story stops being about a loom and starts being about something else. Putting dollars on. You know what happened to American manufacturing in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The mills that had defined Gaston County for 4 generations were closing or had already closed. $30. The Lorry plant that Earl had given 30 years to had been running reduced shifts since 1986 and shut entirely in 1990. 41 mills in North Carolina closed between 1989 and 1993. 41 communities that had organized their entire economic and social architecture around industrial textile production found that architecture dismantled with a speed that nobody who'd grown up inside it had believed possible. The market did the opposite. 300. While industrial textile revenue in North Carolina fell by 30% in 4 years, handmade textile sales at regional craft shows and galleries increased every year of that same period. $100 on. People who had bought machine-made goods without thinking about them for decades began, in the absence of local manufacturing, $14 on, to notice the difference between something made by a machine in a country they'd never been to and something made by a person 2 counties over. Dorothy had understood this before it happened. She'd seen it in that exhibition hall in 1984. She'd bought the broken loom in 1987, betting on a shift that most people around her didn't yet feel coming. She had spent those years building a business that the economic collapse of her industry couldn't touch, because her business was premised on exactly what the collapse had destroyed: handmade, local, personal. The thing the mills couldn't sell. In the summer of 1992, the old Briggs storefront on Main, not Carl Briggs the liquidator, different Briggs, came available. It had been a hardware store for 30 years, then empty for 2. On. The owner wanted $550 a month, which was below market, because he'd grown up in that building and wanted it occupied by something he wasn't embarrassed by. Dorothy walked through it twice, measured everything, and went home to her notebook. She ran the numbers for 3 weeks. She ran them from every direction. The rent, the utilities, the additional equipment she'd need to run a retail operation alongside production, the additional labor. She looked at her savings account, 9 years of a business that spent less than it earned, reinvested carefully, and never took on debt. She called the landlord on a Thursday evening. She told him she'd take it at $500 a month on a 2-year lease, with an option to purchase the building at fair market value at the end of the term. The landlord, a man named Harold, who'd been expecting a negotiation that went the other way, said he'd think about it. He called back on Friday. He said yes. Dorothy opened Vance Textiles in October of 1992. Loom in the back, visible through a glass partition so customers could watch the cloth being made. Finished goods in the front, priced honestly and described accurately, with small cards next to each piece explaining the weave structure and the fiber content in language that assumed the customer was intelligent. Renee ran the front on weekends. San, Cecilia's sister, handled alterations work that Dorothy still took in because she didn't believe in turning away a customer who needed something. Earl Stover came to the opening. He was 71 years old, retired 4 years, and he stood in front of the glass partition, watching the loom run for a long time without saying anything. "Is it the same machine?" he finally asked Renee. "Be same machine. $40, the one from the liquidation. $10, the one from the liquidation." Earl looked at the cloth coming off the warp beam, the shed opening and closing, the beater swinging, the shuttle carrying its thread through the opening with a sound that was, to anyone who'd grown up inside a working mill, as familiar as breathing. He'd spent 30 years listening to machines like this. He'd watched them all go quiet. "On, your mother paid $200 for that," he said. "And probably 300 hours," Renee said. 400, Earl said. He'd watched more of those hours than Renee knew. He'd been over that fence more times than he'd admitted. Watching, occasionally advising, mostly just being present in the way that older tradespeople sometimes are when they see younger ones doing the work correctly. "Tell her I said the timing belt sounds good." Renee smiled. "She'll want to know how you can tell from out here." "Because I can't hear it," Earl said. "When a timing belt sounds good, you don't hear it at all." Dorothy exercised the purchase option on the building in 1994. The fair market value, 2 years into the manufacturing decline, was $41,000 for a Main Street storefront that would have appraised at $70,000 in 1986. She paid it in full. No mortgage, no partner, no loan from a bank that would want a lien on what she'd built. The people who had watched the loom go on to that flatbed in 1987 were still living on the same streets. Some of them had done well, some of them had not. The mill closures had rearranged the county in ways that a person could spend years sorting through without reaching the bottom of it. Dorothy didn't sort through it with satisfaction. She had worked alongside too many mill people, had listened to Earl talk about the Lorry plant, with the particular tenderness of a man who has lost a thing he loved. To feel anything other than a complicated sadness about what her industry had become. She owned her building. She owned her loom. She owned her loom. She owned her time, and through her time she owned her income, and the bank couldn't restructure any of those things because she'd never put them in a bank's hands. At the North Carolina Craft Guild's annual meeting in 1997, Dorothy was asked to speak on the subject of transitioning from hobbyist to commercial textile production. She was 51 years old. She had never spoken at a guild meeting. She almost sent a letter declining, and then decided that was the wrong kind of cowardice. $100 on. She stood at the front of a hotel conference room in High Point with a notepad she didn't end up using and looked at the people who'd come to hear her. A room full of weavers, potters, woodworkers, jewelers, people who made things with their hands and were trying to understand how to make a living from it. She didn't talk about the loom. She talked about the notebook. Every repair documented, every expense tracked, every hour logged, not to bill someone but to understand the true cost of what she was making. She said that most craft businesses failed not because the work was bad, but because the maker never understood what the work actually cost them, and so they priced it wrong. And they couldn't sustain it. $40 on, and they told themselves the market didn't value handmade work, when the truth was they'd priced handmade work as if their time was worth nothing. And she said, "The loom is not the business. The loom is what makes the product. The business is everything you do to understand what the product is worth and find the people willing to pay for it. If you believe the work is worth something, you have to charge what it's worth. The market can't tell you your work has value if you've already told the market it doesn't." She said, "I bought a broken loom for $200 in 1987 because I understood what it would cost to fix it, and I knew the market it would serve, and I had done the arithmetic on whether the one was worth the other. It was. That's the whole story. There's no secret to it. There's only the arithmetic, and whether you're willing to trust what the arithmetic tells you." She paused. "Own a building on Main Street in Gaston County that I paid for in full in 1994. I own it because my loom cost $327 to put into service instead of $20,400 to buy new. I own it because I tracked every expense for 9 years and never spent money I hadn't already earned. I own it because when the mills closed and the county changed, I was running a business that the mills couldn't compete with. Not because I was smarter than the mills. Because I was smaller than the mills. Small enough to make something a person could hold in their hands and know it was made by another person." She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms go quiet when something true has been said plainly enough that nobody needs to add to it. Earl Stover had not been at the guild meeting. He died in 1995, quietly, in the house next door to where Dorothy's loom still ran. She'd been with him the week before, and he'd asked her to open the garage door so he could hear it from the hospital bed his son had set up in the living room. She'd opened it. The draper ran through its cycles in the morning light, beater swinging, reed opening and closing, the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Earl had listened with his eyes closed and said that the timing belt still sounded good. $1,400. After the guild meeting, a young woman came up to Dorothy in the parking lot. She was in her late 20s, had a notebook under her arm, and had the look of someone who had been taking notes for 2 hours straight. "You bought," she said. "The Draper X3. You said $200. $100 at liquidation," Dorothy said. $127 in parts and materials, $327 total. $40, and you've been running it since 1988. Since June of 1988. The young woman looked down at her notebook, then back up. "The loom I want is $4,900. I've been saving for 2 years. 41. Is there a broken one available for less?" The young woman blinked. "Find out what's broken," Dorothy said. "Find out what it costs to fix it. Do the arithmetic. The arithmetic doesn't lie. It'll tell you whether it's worth your time, and if it is, it'll tell you what to do next." He drove back to Gaston County on a 2-lane highway that ran past the dark windows of closed mills. Buildings she'd seen full of noise and light for most of her life. buildings that now stood like monuments to everything the county had decided it could not afford to keep. She didn't look at them with bitterness, $40 on. She looked at them the way her mother had looked at a garment that couldn't be saved, with a clear-eyed assessment of what had gone wrong and a quiet intention to do better with the next one. Renee runs the shop now. She added a second loom in 2001, a different brand, newer. On bought used from a closing studio in Virginia for $340 because Renee had learned from watching her mother that you assess the machine in front of you and not the machine you wish you had. Dorothy still comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She warps. She runs the occasional complex pattern that Renee calls hers, but that Dorothy usually finishes because some knowledge only transfers through hands. Draper X3 is still running. Dorothy has put 4 timing belts on it in 36 years, 2 sets of heddle frames, 1 reed, and a warp beam bearing set she sourced from a retired mill mechanic in Kannapolis, who'd been holding them since 1988 in case someone ever needed them. He'd kept them because he knew that the machines worth keeping were the ones built before the Industria decided that maintenance was more expensive than replacement. He was right. $40 on. Dorothy paid him $45 for the set and drove home through the county where the mills were dark and her loom was still running. $100. A broken reed, a burned relay. A woman who had spent 20 years learning to see the distance between a pile of parts and a working machine as nothing more than knowledge and time. He said nobody wanted that loom, nobody but Dorothy. And when they finally understood what she'd built with it, not just the cloth, not just the shop, but the building paid for in cash, $40 on. The business that survived what destroyed everything around it. Put it on, the livelihood passed to her daughter and her daughter's hands. They understood what Dorothy had seen standing in that mill yard in 1987, with Carl Briggs telling her she was wrong. She wasn't looking at a broken loom, she was looking at everything that came after. I keep thinking about the moment Carl Briggs told Dorothy she was wrong, not cruelly. Just practically, the way people deliver bad news they think is a kindness. He walked her through every reason the machine wasn't worth what she was about to pay, and she listened to all of it, and then she paid anyway. Not because she was stubborn, because she'd already done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic didn't agree with Carl. It's the part that stays with me. Dorothy wasn't guessing. She'd spent 30 months building a case for a decision that looked, from the outside, like impulse. She'd driven to Asheville. She'd filled 17 pages of notes. She'd priced every component down to the relay. When she handed over $200 in that mill yard, she wasn't taking a risk. She was collecting on research. Something in that worth sitting with. We talk about courage like it's the absence of doubt. Like the people who do hard things simply don't feel what the rest of us feel. But Dorothy felt it. She heard Roy explaining why they should turn the truck around. She heard Carl listing every way she was wrong. Reson. She just had something underneath all that noise, a notebook, a pencil, and the honesty to trust what they told her more than she trusted the opinions of people who hadn't done the work she'd done. That's not fearlessness. That's a different kind of preparation. Mother Iris gave her that, not the weaving, the habit of mind, the small handwriting in the notebook, the conviction that truth lives in the details, not in the broad strokes. Iris pressed seams with moral certainty because she understood that the quality of a thing is built in the parts nobody watches. Dorothy inherited that understanding and applied it to everything: machines, money, time, the true cost of what her hands produced. She didn't cut corners because Iris had spent 20 years teaching her, without ever saying the words, that corners are where the work lives. 14, and then she held on to it. For 14 months in a garage while her daughters grew up around her. For 9 years of alterations, work that most people would have abandoned for something easier. For the entire decade, while the mills went dark, and the county rearranged itself around the absence of what had defined it. She didn't flinch. She didn't expand on credit when the good years came. Didn't despair when the industry collapsed. Because she had built something the collapse couldn't reach. What I think about most is the building. The one she bought in 1994 for $41,000 cash while the market was soft, and the county was grieving. She didn't buy it because she was wealthy. She bought it because she'd spent years refusing to spend money she hadn't earned, and the years had accumulated into something solid. Every repair done herself, instead of contracted out. Every machine bought broken and rebuilt, instead of purchased new. Every color, every dollar tracked in a notebook because the notebook told the truth, and Dorothy Vance had always preferred truth to comfort. Rehan. Earl heard the loom from across the fence and came to look. He'd spent 30 years inside the industry that built those machines and watched it disappear. What he saw in Dorothy's garage was something the industry had never been able to manufacture. A person who understood what she was doing and why, who had built her livelihood on knowledge instead of credit. Who would still be running when everything around her had gone quiet. Timing belt sounds good, he said, when you can't hear it at all. I think that's true of most things worth building.